The first time I saw a shelf of unlabeled glass jars in an Amish farmhouse pantry, I assumed I was looking at pickles. I was wrong. What I was actually looking at was a food tradition that predates refrigeration, predates the grocery store, and in a strange twist, predates almost every gut health trend currently being sold back to us in a plastic bottle for $30. Almost nobody realizes that the flavor you associate with old-fashioned home cooking, that sharp, tangy, alive taste, used to be considered essential. Today it's considered a garnish. Somewhere between your grandmother's kitchen and the modern supermarket aisle, an entire category of food quietly disappeared from the American table. And the people who never stopped making it happen to be some of the last communities in the country still doing it exactly the way it was done 200 years ago. If you're new here, welcome to NexReveal, the channel where we go looking for the knowledge that got left behind, the forgotten techniques, the practical chemistry, the old world engineering that worked fine for generations before it got replaced by something faster, shinier, and usually worse. We don't do hype here. We go to the source, we look at the history, we look at the science, and we show you exactly how to do it yourself. Today's subject is a fermented condiment that Amish and Mennonite households in Pennsylvania and Ohio have quietly kept alive, while the rest of the country forgot it existed. It costs about $2 a batch. It takes 15 minutes of hands-on time. And once you understand what's actually happening inside that jar, you'll understand exactly why large-scale food manufacturers never had a reason to bring it back. Here's the thing you have to understand about fermentation before we go any further, because it explains everything that follows. For most of human history, fermentation wasn't a wellness trend. It was survival infrastructure. Before refrigeration existed, before canning was invented in the early 1800s, communities all over the world, independently on different continents with no contact with each other, arrived at the same basic discovery. If you combine a vegetable or root with salt or acid and let beneficial bacteria take over before harmful ones can, you get a food that doesn't spoil, tastes stronger, and in many cases becomes more nutritious than it started. Sauerkraut in Central Europe, kimchi in Korea, pickled ginger in parts of Asia, and in the farmhouses of Lancaster County and Holmes County, a home-fermented horseradish preparation that got passed down in the same handwritten recipe books used for bread and canning. So what happened to it? This is where the story gets interesting, because the answer isn't a conspiracy, it's economics. And understanding the economics tells you something important about your own kitchen. Commercial food production runs on shelf stability and predictable output. A living ferment, by definition, keeps changing. The bacteria keep working. The flavor keeps developing. 2 jars started on the same day from the same ingredients can taste slightly different depending on the temperature of the room they sat in. That's a nightmare for a factory that needs every jar on every shelf in every state to taste identical. So the food industry did what it does well. It solved the problem by removing the variable. Modern shelf-stable horseradish, the kind in a jar at the grocery store, is almost always pasteurized, which means heated to a temperature that kills the exact bacterial activity that made the traditional version worth making in the first place. You get the heat and the sharpness, you lose the tang, the acidity, and the microbial life. It's not that anyone hid the traditional method. It's that mass production and living fermentation are structurally incompatible, and the living version simply never had a large company motivated to keep it in front of you. But that's only part of the story, because the why only matters once you understand the what. So let's actually build this thing the way it's been built in these communities for generations, because the process itself tells you something about why it works. The traditional base is remarkably simple. Raw apple cider vinegar, ideally the unfiltered kind with visible sediment, raw unpasteurized honey, and fresh horseradish root grated by hand. You combine roughly 1 cup of vinegar, half a cup of honey, and 3 to 4 ounces of grated horseradish in a clean quart jar. You stir with a wooden or plastic utensil rather than metal, since metal can react with the acidity over time and affect flavor. You cap the jar loosely rather than sealing it airtight, because the mixture needs to breathe as it develops. Then it goes into a cool, dark cupboard for roughly 2 weeks with a gentle daily stir. Here's where things become interesting, because what's happening inside that jar during those 14 days is genuine, well-documented food chemistry, not folklore. Apple cider vinegar starts out with a pH around 3, which is already inhospitable to most harmful bacteria. As the honey dissolves into the vinegar, it becomes food for the natural microbial populations already present on the horseradish root surface. This is the same basic principle behind sourdough starters and many pickle brines. Over the following days, those microbes produce additional organic acids, including lactic acid, which is the same acid produced by beneficial bacteria in a healthy human gut. Meanwhile, the horseradish itself is undergoing its own transformation. Horseradish contains compounds called glucosinolates, which are responsible for its sharp, sinus-clearing bite. In an acidic environment, these compounds break down into a related family of active isothiocyanate compounds, and food science research has shown that this enzymatic activity is actually enhanced, not diminished, by acidic conditions. In plain terms, the vinegar isn't just preserving the horseradish, it's chemically transforming it into something slightly different from what you started with. The people who developed this method 2 centuries ago had no vocabulary for glucosinolates or isothiocyanates. What they had was generational observation. They knew which batches tasted right, which ones smelled correct, and which combinations of ingredients reliably produced a condiment their families wanted to eat all winter. That's the deeper story hiding underneath the recipe itself. An entire body of applied chemistry developed through trial and error across generations, long before anyone had a laboratory to explain why it worked. Now, before you assume this only applies if you live near a working farm, let me stop you there, because that assumption is exactly what keeps people from ever trying it. You do not need land. You do not need livestock. You do not need a root cellar dug into a hillside. You need a mason jar, a cool interior cupboard, and about 15 minutes. If your home stays somewhere between 60 and 75 degrees, which describes the overwhelming majority of American homes year-round, you already have everything required. An interior closet, away from exterior walls that swing in temperature with the weather outside, works just as well as any dedicated root cellar ever did. Total ingredient cost for a full batch typically lands under $3, and a jar of fresh horseradish root from a produce section will usually make more than one batch. If you're finding this kind of forgotten practical knowledge useful, this is exactly the kind of thing we dig into every week on NexReveal. So consider staying with us for what comes next, because the story doesn't end with the base recipe. What most modern accounts of Amish food traditions miss is that fermentation in these communities was never treated as a single static recipe. It was treated as a living system, refined and adapted household by household. Many families developed secondary variations, adding garlic, mustard seed, or other aromatics to an already established ferment to create new flavor profiles for different dishes, from roast meats to root vegetables to sandwiches. This layering process, where an established culture becomes the base for something new rather than being discarded, is actually a well-recognized principle in fermentation more broadly. It's the same logic behind using a sourdough starter to begin a new loaf, or using existing kombucha to start a fresh batch. The established microbial community gives the new batch a head start, and often a more complex flavor than starting from scratch. This is also where the historical thread gets genuinely fascinating, because it connects to something much older than Pennsylvania Dutch country. The core technique, acid plus time plus a live culture, traces back independently to nearly every agricultural civilization that needed to preserve food through a winter without refrigeration. Roman writers documented vinegar-based preservation methods. Medieval European households kept mother cultures for vinegar, the same way modern bakers keep sourdough starters alive for decades. The specific horseradish-honey-vinegar combination popular in Pennsylvania Dutch and Amish communities likely descends from broader German and Central European root vegetable preservation traditions brought over by settlers in the 18th century. Adapted over time to what grew well in the soil of Lancaster County and similar regions, what looks like a quaint regional recipe is actually the visible tip of a preservation technology that helped keep entire civilizations fed through winters with no electricity and no grocery store. So why does any of this matter today, beyond nostalgia? A few real, practical reasons worth taking seriously. First, homemade ferments genuinely do develop nutritional properties that differ from their raw ingredients. Research on fermented foods has repeatedly shown that fermentation can increase concentrations of certain B vitamins and organic acids as microbial populations metabolize the base ingredients. Second, understanding basic fermentation is a legitimately useful preparedness skill. It's a low-cost, low-tech method of extending the usable life of produce, which matters whether you're managing a garden surplus or simply trying to waste less food. Third, and maybe most importantly, it reconnects you to a category of flavor that mass-produced pasteurized condiments genuinely cannot replicate, because pasteurization is specifically designed to stop the very process that creates that flavor in the first place. None of this means abandoning modern food safety practices. Traditional methods still require basic hygiene, clean jars, fresh ingredients, and attention to how the ferment looks and smells. A harmless white film on the surface, sometimes called calm yeast, is common and simply skimmed off. Actual mold, fuzzy colored spreading, means the batch should be discarded. These distinctions were passed down through direct experience in households that made this food constantly, generation after generation, and they're worth taking seriously rather than guessing. If any of this has made you want to try it yourself, that's exactly the goal. And if you want more of these deep dives into preserved knowledge and practical self-reliance, subscribing to NexReveal means you won't miss the next one. Here's what I keep coming back to. This wasn't secret knowledge, hoarded or hidden. It was ordinary knowledge, practiced constantly that simply stopped being necessary for most of us the moment refrigeration and industrial food processing became universal. Nothing was stolen. It just stopped being useful to remember until people started wondering why food used to taste different, and why some of the healthiest habits in American history came from kitchens with no electricity at all. Somewhere in that gap between convenience and tradition sits a genuinely useful skill, sitting quietly in a mason jar in a cool cupboard, waiting for someone to decide it's worth 2 weeks and $2 to find out for themselves. Make the batch. Watch what 2 weeks of patience actually does. And ask yourself what else got quietly left behind in the name of convenience.